Welcome to J&M Bedtime Stories, where true crime meets tranquility. Every night we bring you hauntingly fascinating true crime tales, told in a soothing tone designed to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. But here's a little mystery we haven't solved yet. Over 95% of our listeners aren't subscribed. That's right, most of you tuning in right now haven't hit that button. If you enjoy relaxing with a dark tale before bed, help us reach our goal of 10,000 subscribers. Just tap that subscribe button. It's free and it helps us keep the stories coming night after night. Now get comfortable, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's get into tonight's cases. Montana. On June 25th, 1983, 4-year-old Nyleen K. Marshall vanished without a trace in the Elkhorn Mountains near Helena, Montana. She had been on a family picnic at Bear Creek in the Helena National Forest, surrounded by friends, relatives, and other children. While the adults chatted nearby, the children played by the creek. At some point, Nyleen wandered slightly away from the group with a few of the other kids, but when the others returned, Nyleen didn't. Her disappearance triggered an enormous search. Hundreds of volunteers scoured the area. Bloodhounds, helicopters, and search teams combed the rugged forest terrain, but not a single trace was found. No clothing, no footprints, nothing. For a while, people wondered, did she fall? Was it an animal attack? Or had she simply gotten lost in the wilderness? But then, suspicions shifted. Some witnesses reported seeing a man in a jogging suit nearby, behaving strangely. One child said they saw Nyleen speaking to a man shortly before she vanished. That's when the theory of abduction took hold. 2 years later, the case took an even darker turn. In 1985 and 1986, someone began making phone calls to law enforcement and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. He claimed he had Nyleen. He said he had taken her because he loved her and was raising her as his own daughter. Then came the letters. Typed, mailed from Madison, Wisconsin, and full of deeply unsettling details. Details that had never been made public. The man claimed he homeschooled her, that they traveled often to Canada, to Mexico, across the United States, that she was healthy, cared for, and called by her middle name, Kay. He said he never took her to doctors or schools to avoid detection. He expressed remorse, but claimed he couldn't return her without facing arrest. The authorities believed the letters were authentic. They contained information that only someone involved in the disappearance could have known. But the man was never identified. In 1990, the case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, drawing national attention. Not long after the episode aired, a girl in a New Orleans hospital claimed to be Nyleen. Authorities investigated, but it was another dead end. Years passed. Her mother, Nancy Marshall, tragically lost her life in the 1990s while working as a missionary nurse in Mexico. Her father, Kim, never stopped hoping for answers. To this day, Nyleen K. Marshall remains missing. Her case is still open. No one knows who took her. No one knows what really happened in those quiet Montana woods. And no one knows if she's still out there somewhere. Nebraska. On November 15, 2017, 24-year-old Sydney Loof vanished without a trace. A bright, kind-hearted young woman from Lincoln, Nebraska, Sydney worked at the local Menards store and was known for her warm smile and love of animals. That evening, she had a second date planned with someone she met on Tinder. The person she was meeting was 23-year-old Bailey Boswell. Their first date had gone well enough that Sydney was excited for another. She even posted a Snapchat selfie that night, captioned, "Ready for my date." It would be the last time anyone heard from her. When Sydney failed to show up for work the next day, her family grew concerned. Days turned into nights. A frantic search began. Friends, family, and volunteers scoured the area while investigators tried to retrace her last known steps. As the investigators dug deeper, they discovered Bailey hadn't been alone. She was living with a 51-year-old man named Aubrey Trail, her boyfriend and partner in what would soon be revealed as a horrifying scheme. The two fled Nebraska shortly after Sydney disappeared. Before vanishing, Bailey and Aubrey were caught on camera buying tools, drop cloths, bleach, and hacksaws, a chilling list of supplies. Authorities tracked their movements through surveillance and digital forensics, and after a nationwide manhunt, they were arrested in Missouri. On December 4th, 2017, nearly 3 weeks after she vanished, Sydney's dismembered remains were found in garbage bags scattered across a remote field. The cause of death? Homicidal violence. Aubrey Trail confessed during his trial. He claimed Sydney died accidentally during a consensual encounter involving asphyxiation, but the evidence told another story. Prosecutors revealed Trail and Boswell had lured Sydney through a fake online persona. They were obsessed with control and power, and investigators believed they planned the murder. During his 2019 trial, Trail caused a scene, yelling in court and even slashing his own neck with a razor blade. He survived, and later he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Bailey Boswell, who claimed she feared Trail and was under his influence, was also convicted and became the first woman in Nebraska to face a death sentence in over a century. Sydney Loof's family has since turned their grief into action, raising awareness about online safety and the hidden dangers of digital dating. Her story is a tragic reminder that behind the screen, not everyone is who they claim to be. Nevada. Catherine Ann Howard, 35 years old, was last seen alive leaving her apartment in northeast Reno. She was intelligent, hardworking, and well-liked by her colleagues. But in the early morning hours of that spring day, something went terribly wrong. She never made it to work. Hours passed, then days. When Catherine didn't show up or call in, her employer grew concerned. Her friends knew this wasn't like her. She was dependable and reliable. They soon contacted the police. Reno police arrived at Catherine's home and found no signs of forced entry, but inside they noticed something chilling. Her purse was there, so were her keys. The scene looked almost paused, as if she had stepped out for just a moment, but she hadn't returned. 3 days later, on March 21st, hikers near a remote stretch of the desert east of Reno spotted something unusual, a partially buried body. It was Catherine. She had been beaten, bound, and strangled to death. Investigators later confirmed she had been assaulted. Her body was dumped off a dirt road and hastily covered. The brutality of the crime shook the city. but the case would go cold. For nearly 2 decades, no arrest, no answers. In 2002, Reno detectives reopened the cold case as part of a push to retest DNA evidence. Technology had evolved, and now there was a viable sample from the crime scene. The DNA matched Thomas Edward Creech, an inmate on death row in Idaho. Creech was already one of Idaho's most notorious killers, convicted of multiple murders across several states, but he had never been linked to Catherine until the DNA hit. In 2021, Washoe County prosecutors filed murder charges against him. He was extradited to Nevada to face trial nearly 40 years after Catherine was taken from her family. Creech pled guilty in exchange for a life sentence in Nevada. His admission finally brought a measure of closure, though not peace, to a family who had waited decades for justice. Catherine Ann Howard was not forgotten. It took time, it took technology, but her voice was heard. New Hampshire. A promising student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Maura emailed professors saying there'd been a death in the family. That wasn't true. No one in her family had died. She packed her car, withdrew $280 from an ATM, bought alcohol, and drove north. Her destination? Unknown. Her reasons? Still unclear. Around 7:27 p.m., a resident heard a loud thump. Maura's black sedan had crashed into a snowbank. A local bus driver stopped to help. She said she had already called for roadside assistance, but she hadn't. By the time the police arrived, just after 7:45 p.m., Maura was gone. No footprints led away from the car, no sign of a struggle, just a bottle of wine on the back seat and a rag stuffed into the tailpipe. In the hours before her disappearance, Maura had searched for lodging in Vermont and New Hampshire. She didn't tell friends where she was going. She hadn't packed hiking gear or cold weather clothing. Maura's father, Fred Murray, believes she was met with foul play. Others suspect she walked into the woods distraught and succumbed to the elements. But no trace of her, no clothing, phone, or body has ever been found. Despite extensive searches, interviews, and renewed public interest, Maura's case remains one of the most haunting cold cases. She was 21 years old with her whole life ahead of her, and then just gone. What really happened to Maura Murray? Was she running from something or towards something? And why has no one seen her since? New Jersey. It was just after 7 p.m. on February 1st, 2023, when gunshots echoed through the quiet Camelot at Lemur apartment complex. Councilwoman Eunice Dwumfor, only 30 years old, had just pulled into her driveway. Moments later, she was ambushed in her white Nissan SUV. Multiple shots were fired. Her vehicle rolled down a small hill and crashed into parked cars. Eunice was a mother, a pastor, and a newly elected Republican councilwoman, known for her deep faith and infectious positivity. She had just begun her term in office. Police found her dead at the scene, shot multiple times. No signs of robbery, no known enemies, and no immediate suspects. Her death shocked the community, a young leader gunned down without warning. Friends described her as kind and devoted. Her church, Champions Royal Assembly, mourned a loss they couldn't explain. For months, there were no arrests. Rumors swirled. Was it political? personal, religious, authorities remained tight-lipped. Then, in May 2023, a breakthrough. Rashid Ali Bynum, a 28-year-old man from Virginia with ties to the same church as Eunice, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Investigators traced his cell phone and vehicle from Virginia to New Jersey that day. Surveillance video, phone records, a contact saved in her phone, the pieces all came together. But the questions still remain. What was the motive? Prosecutors haven't revealed anything. Her family and the community wait. Eunice Womfor's life was full of promise. Her story now a tragic reminder of how quickly light can be taken by darkness. New Mexico, February 2nd, 2009, on the desolate outskirts of Albuquerque, New Mexico, a woman walking her dog stumbles upon something that would ignite one of the city's most haunting mysteries. She finds a human bone. At first, police assume it's an isolated case, but soon more remains surface. When the digging is done, authorities have uncovered the skeletal remains of 11 women and one unborn child, all buried in shallow graves, all murdered, and all dumped in a remote stretch of land known as the West Mesa. The victims range in age from 15 to 32. Most are Hispanic. All of them had been reported missing between 2003 and 2005. The site where the remains were found was once a quiet construction zone, part of a housing development that stalled with the 2008 financial crash. Before then, it had been mostly untouched desert. This gave the killer the perfect cover. For years, families of the missing had begged police to investigate. Many of the women had vanished under eerily similar circumstances, but their lifestyles led some investigators to dismiss the disappearances. Now faced with the undeniable evidence of a serial killer, detective launched what would become one of the largest investigations in New Mexico history. Thousands of tips poured in, leads spanned states, suspects emerged and disappeared. One suspect, Lorenzo Montoya, lived just miles from the burial site. He had a history of violence against women and a chilling incident in 2006. Montoya strangled an adult worker in his trailer, then was shot dead by her pimp. After his death, the killings appeared to stop. But without forensic evidence tying him to the West Mesa victims, the case remained open. Investigators also examined satellite images, hoping to pinpoint where the graves were dug. This method confirmed that the burials happened during a tight window between 2003 and 2005. Despite rewards and years of work, the case remains unsolved. No one has been charged. For Albuquerque, the West Mesa murders are a dark reminder of the vulnerable being forgotten until it's too late. 12 souls buried in silence, a killer still unaccounted for, and a city still searching for justice. Someone out there knows the truth. New York. It was 3:15 a.m. on March 13, 1964, when 28-year-old Catherine Kitty Genovese parked her red Fiat just 100 feet from her apartment building in Kew Gardens, Queens. She had just finished her shift managing a local bar and was headed home, but she never made it inside. As she walked towards her apartment, a man stepped out of the shadows. His name was Winston Mosley, a 29-year-old married man and father of two. With no connection to Kitty, He had simply decided that night to kill a woman. Any woman. Mosley approached from behind and stabbed her twice in the back. Kitty screamed, "Oh my God, he stabbed me, help me." A light flickered on in a nearby apartment. A man shouted, "Leave that girl alone." Mosley ran, but only briefly. After waiting in his car for 10 minutes and seeing no police, no one coming to Kitty's aid, he returned. He found her crawling towards the back of her building, trying to reach a locked door. Bleeding and disoriented, she was still alive. Mosley stabbed her again, then assaulted her. Then he stabbed her one final time, killing her. It wasn't until 3:50 a.m. that someone finally called the police. Kitty was taken away by ambulance, but she was already gone. At first, the murder seemed just another tragic act of urban violence, but 2 weeks later, an article in the New York Times changed everything. The headline read, "37 who saw murder didn't call the police." The public was horrified. According to the story, dozens of people had heard Kitty's screams, saw some part of the attack, but no one intervened. No one helped. No one even picked up the phone. The nation asked, how could this happen? This chilling incident led psychologists Bob Latane and John Darley to coin the term bystander effect, the phenomenon where the presence of others discourages individuals from helping in an emergency. The Kitty Genovese case became a cornerstone of modern social psychology. Winston Mosley was caught just 6 days later after being arrested for a separate burglary. He confessed not only to Kitty's murder, but to 2 other killings and numerous assaults. He was sentenced to death, later commuted to life in prison. He died in 2016 after more than 50 years behind bars. In the end, Kitty Genovese became more than a victim. Her name became a symbol, a painful lesson about silence, apathy, and the cost of inaction. Her story is a reminder, not acting is a choice, and sometimes that choice has deadly consequences. North Carolina. It was February 17, 1970, around 3:45 a.m., when military police at Fort Bragg received a frantic call from Army Surgeon Captain Jeffrey McDonald. He reported a stabbing at his home on 544 Castle Drive. When they arrived, they found a horrifying scene. Inside the McDonald home, they discovered the brutally beaten and stabbed bodies of his pregnant wife Colette and their 2 daughters, 5-year-old Kimberly and 2-year-old Kristen. Jeffrey McDonald himself had sustained relatively minor injuries, a puncture wound to the chest, and some bruises. McDonald told investigators that intruders had broken in. 3 men and a blonde woman in a floppy hat. He said they chanted, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs," as they attacked the family. A claim chillingly reminiscent of the recent Manson family murders in California. McDonald claimed that he was asleep on the couch and awoke to Colette's screams. He described a chaotic struggle, 3 men attacking him with an ice pick and club, while the woman stood by chanting. He said he lost consciousness and awoke to find his wife and daughters dead. The brutality was staggering. Colette had been bludgeoned and stabbed at least 21 times with an ice pick and 16 times with a knife. Kimberly had been clubbed in the head and stabbed, while little Kristen was stabbed over 30 times. But soon, Army Criminal Investigation Division began to doubt McDonald's story. There were no signs of forced entry, no muddy footprints, no evidence of a struggle consistent with his account, and his injuries were deemed superficial, more self-inflicted than defensive. Blood evidence painted a different story. Each family member had a different blood type, and their patterns throughout the house told investigators who was attacked and where. The findings suggested McDonald had moved around freely during or after the murders. Despite the growing suspicions, a military hearing in late 1970 dismissed the charges against him, citing insufficient evidence. McDonald was honorably discharged and moved to California, resuming his career as a doctor. But Colette's stepfather, Alfred Kassab, was not convinced. He had once believed in McDonald's innocence, but after reviewing the case files and inconsistencies, he pushed for justice. For nearly a decade, he lobbied prosecutors to take another look. In 1975, a federal grand jury was convened. 4 years later, in 1979, Jeffrey McDonald was indicted for the murders of his wife and daughters. The trial began in 1979. The prosecution laid out forensic evidence, inconsistencies in McDonald's statements, and behavioral red flags. The defense argued that he was a victim of a botched investigation and pointed to a woman named Helena Stokely, who had once confessed to being in the house that night. Stokely, a known drug user, had given conflicting statements over the years. Sometimes she claimed involvement, sometimes she denied it, but the jury remained unconvinced by her testimony. On August 29, 1979, Jeffrey McDonald was found guilty of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms. Over the years, McDonald has maintained his innocence, filing numerous appeals. In 2012, the case was revisited with new DNA evidence, but none of it exonerated him. In 2021, the Fourth Circuit Court upheld his conviction again. Today, Jeffrey McDonald remains incarcerated. Over 5 decades have passed since that brutal night in 1970. The questions may linger, but the justice system has rendered its verdict. North Dakota. Monday morning, April 1st, 2019. Employees began arriving at RJR Maintenance and Management in Mandan, North Dakota, a quiet property management company just outside Bismarck. But something was off. The front door was unlocked, unusual for that hour. Inside, a horrific scene was discovered. 4 people, Robert Fackler, co-owner of the company, and 3 employees, Adam Fuhrer, Lois Cobb, and William Cobb, were found brutally murdered. Each victim had suffered both gunshot and stab wounds. Some had signs of blunt force trauma. The scene was chaotic. Signs of struggle, blood spatter, and disarray throughout the office. The Mandan police launched an immediate investigation. The community was in shock. Quadruple homicides are rare anywhere. In North Dakota, they're almost unheard of. Surveillance footage from the early morning hours showed a suspect entering the building shortly before 7 a.m., dressed in all black, with his face mostly concealed. The figure moved with purpose. He appeared to know the layout. Detectives combed through local tips, background checks, and camera footage, and one name started to surface: Chad Isaac. A chiropractor from Washburn, about 35 miles north of Mandan, Isaac had rented a lot from RJR. There had been no formal disputes, but authorities discovered that Isaac had visited the RJR office multiple times. A search warrant was issued. When police searched Isaac's home, vehicle, and office, what they found was chilling. Dark clothing matching the footage, knives, a mask, traces of blood and DNA evidence that would later link him to the crime scene, gunshot residue on his hands, and inside his washing machine, items being bleached. Though Isaac had no criminal history and no clear motive, the physical evidence was mounting. He was arrested 4 days after the murder and charged with 4 counts of murder, burglary, concealment of a body, and unauthorized use of a vehicle. Throughout the investigation and trial, Isaac maintained his innocence. The motive, still unclear. Prosecutors suggested a grudge against RJR, possibly over eviction threats or minor disputes, but no concrete motive was ever fully established. In August 2021, Chad Isaac was found guilty on all counts. During sentencing, family members of the victims delivered emotional statements. Isaac received 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. To this day, the reason behind the brutality remains largely speculative. No confession, no clear motive, just 4 lives lost in a calculated, chilling act of violence that left a community searching for answers. RJR Maintenance and Management continues to operate, but the memory of that day will never leave the building or the town of Mandan. Ohio. In the early hours of April 11, 1993, Lucasville Correctional Facility, located in southern Ohio, was about to become the epicenter of one of the longest and deadliest prison riots in U.S. history. But to understand what happened that day, we need to look back at what led to it. Lucasville was overcrowded, like most prisons during the 80s and 90s. Tensions had been brewing for months. Inmates were dealing with subpar conditions, poor medical care, overcrowded cells, and constant racial tensions between rival prison factions. But it wasn't just the conditions. The facility was divided into 2 main factions, the blacks and the whites, who had a fragile truce. On top of this, a new drug policy was implemented, and the prison staff growing indifference to inmate demands was creating a powder keg ready to explode. At 1 a.m. on that fateful Sunday, the fuse was lit. It began as a small confrontation in the prison yard, which quickly escalated. Inmates seized control of several parts of the facility, taking hostages, guards, and fellow inmates alike. As the inmates flooded the yard and stormed key locations, they demanded better conditions, especially around medical care and the implementation of an inmate grievance system. But the demands were not enough to prevent the riot from spiraling into something much more sinister. The standoff was intense. Among the hostages were 14 prison guards and several other prisoners who had been caught in the crossfire. The inmates, divided between different groups, now had a fragile power structure, but what would follow would become even darker. On the second day the violence escalated. The inmates began killing those they perceived as threats. 2 guards, Officer Robert Vallandingham and Officer William Bill Kegley, were brutally murdered. Robert was killed early in the riot, stabbed in the neck with a makeshift weapon, while William met a horrific fate after being taken hostage. His death would later send shockwaves through the prison system. While the violence escalated, so did the calls for negotiations. Inmate leaders were using the hostages as leverage to demand more food, better medical care, and an end to the corrupt prison administration. The negotiators, state officials, were under extreme pressure. Despite the tense standoff, the rioting factions, which included black Muslim groups, white supremacists, and the mainstream inmates, all needed to come together for the negotiation to work. While the authorities tried to establish a calm, the inmates began implementing their own rules. Some of them took it upon themselves to execute suspected informants, ensuring their own authority in the chaos. After 11 long days with 9 deaths, including guards and inmates, the riot came to an end when the Ohio National Guard was called in. By that time, the facility was a war zone. The prisoners were finally subdued, but the consequences of the riot would resonate for years. The state of Ohio faced criticism from both inside and outside the prison. The failure to prevent the riot was a major blow to the prison system. The following years saw a series of trials. Inmates involved in the murders were sentenced to death, including James Ware, who would later become one of the most infamous figures from the riot. As for the guards, many were left emotionally scarred by the violence they had witnessed. The Lucasville riot remains a powerful reminder of the dangers of overcrowded and poorly managed prison systems. It also highlights the fragility of control in environments where desperation and frustration reach a boiling point. And while the riot ended with the deaths of 10 men, it also sparked reform discussions about prison conditions, the treatment of inmates, and the role of authority in maintaining peace. But for those who lived through it, Lucasville is a scar that will never fade. Oklahoma. The murder of Mark Costello, a respected labor commissioner in Oklahoma, shocked the state and left a lasting impact on his family, colleagues, and the public. The tragic event occurred on August 23, 2015, and the details surrounding it are nothing short of chilling. Mark Costello had been serving as Oklahoma's labor commissioner since 2011. A staunch advocate for workers' rights, he was known for his efforts to improve the working conditions for many Oklahomans. He had a reputation as a dedicated public servant, but in the end, it was his own family that would bring an end to his life. The night began like any other. Mark was with his son, Christian Costello, who was 26 years old at the time. The two had gone out for dinner, a regular father-son evening. Mark's life was not without its challenges, though. He had been dealing with tensions in his family, particularly with Christian, who had a history of mental health struggles and was reportedly battling bipolar disorder. On that fateful evening, the two men arrived at a restaurant in northwest Oklahoma City. At some point during their meal, something happened. According to reports, an argument between Mark and Christian escalated into violence. The dispute grew intense, and Christian, filled with anger, left the restaurant with his father. Witnesses later described the shocking events that unfolded. Christian, enraged and possibly struggling with his mental health issues, pulled out a knife. He attacked his father outside the restaurant. Mark, unable to defend himself, was fatally stabbed multiple times. A nearby witness described hearing the cries for help before seeing Christian run from the scene. Police arrived at the scene to find Mark Costello lying in a pool of his own blood. Paramedics rushed him to a nearby hospital, but it was too late. Mark Costello was pronounced dead shortly after his arrival. Christian was soon arrested, and the details of his mental health came to the forefront. His family's complicated history and Christian's prior struggles with bipolar disorder were publicly discussed. Christian's defense attorneys argued that his actions were driven by mental illness, pointing to his erratic behavior in the days leading up to the murder. After his arrest, Christian was charged with first-degree murder. During his trial, his defense team painted a picture of a young man overwhelmed by his mental health issues, struggling to cope with the demands of his family and life. They argued that Christian's actions weren't premeditated, but were the result of a psychotic episode. The prosecution, however, was firm in its position that Christian had planned the attack. They highlighted the severity of the wounds inflicted on Mark and the fact that Christian had a history of violent behavior. The case was deeply emotional, with family members caught in the midst of a tragic conflict. In the end, Christian Costello pled guilty to second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The case remains a haunting example of how mental illness can dramatically alter the course of a family's life, and how even those closest to us can be capable of unimaginable acts. Mark Costello's death left a void in the Oklahoma labor community and was a painful reminder of the deep complexities surrounding mental health, family dynamics, and violence. His legacy is remembered by many who knew him as a dedicated public servant, but also as a father whose life was tragically cut short by his own son. The murder of Mark Costello will forever be a tragic chapter in Oklahoma's history, a story of loss, pain, and the devastating effects of untreated mental illness. Oregon. On the night of October 19, 2016, in Bend, Oregon, 23-year-old Kaylee Sawyer was last seen leaving her job at a local bar. She was known for her friendly demeanor, a love for animals, and her bright smile, but no one knew that night would be her last. Kaylee had plans that evening, plans that tragically would never be fulfilled. She had just finished a shift at the Redmond bar where she worked and was supposed to head home, but she never made it. The next morning, her family reported her missing. Kaylee's absence wasn't just unusual, it was alarming. Her phone was turned off and her car was still at her apartment. Hours passed. The police scoured the area, trying to retrace her steps, but it wasn't until the evening of October 21st that a horrifying discovery was made. A group of volunteers, along with local law enforcement, found Kaylee's body in a remote area near Cascade Lakes Highway. Her death was ruled a homicide. As investigators began their work, they quickly realized this wasn't a random act. Kaylee's brutal murder pointed to someone who knew her, or at least someone who was familiar with the area. A key part of the investigation revolved around Kaylee's relationship with a man named Kyle R. Cooner. Kyle Cooner, a 34-year-old former convict, had been living in Bend. He had a lengthy criminal history, including previous convictions for assault, and it didn't take long for the police to discover he had crossed paths with Kaylee in the months before her death. As the investigation deepened, the police pieced together Kaylee's last known interactions. They learned that Cooner had been in the same vicinity as Kaylee on the night she disappeared. He was arrested on October 27, 2016, after investigators linked him to the crime scene. Cooner's arrest was a major break in the case, but questions remained. What had happened between him and Kaylee? Why had she been targeted? In 2018, Kyle Cooner went on trial for the murder of Kaylee Sawyer. It was revealed that Cooner had met Kaylee at a bar in Redmond months earlier, and the two had briefly exchanged phone numbers. Cooner's motive was complicated. Evidence suggested that he had been obsessed with Kaylee, but she had no interest in him. The night she was murdered, Cooner allegedly followed her after she left her shift. In a fit of rage, he attacked her, and the violent assault ended her life. The jury found Kyle Cooner guilty of Kaylee's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kaylee's murder rocked the Bend community, leaving a lasting scar. Her family and friends were devastated, but they channeled their grief into action. They created a foundation in Kaylee's memory to help prevent violence and to support victims' families. Kaylee's legacy lives on through the love and kindness she showed while she was alive. Her tragic death serves as a reminder of the devastating impact of violence and the importance of remembering and honoring the lives lost. Though her life was cut short, Kaylee Sawyer will never be forgotten. Pennsylvania. August 28, 2003, in Erie, Pennsylvania, a call comes in to Mamma Mia's Pizzeria. The order: 2 small pizzas to a remote location near a TV tower on the outskirts of town. Brian Wells, a 46-year-old delivery man, takes the call. He drives to the strange location and vanishes. When he reappears, it's with a collar, an actual bomb, locked around his neck. A crude shotgun disguised as a cane in his hand, and a set of bizarre instructions. 2:30 p.m., Wells walks into a PNC bank in Erie and hands the teller a note, demanding $250,000. The teller gives him what they can, $8,702. Minutes later, he's apprehended by police in a nearby parking lot. Sitting cross-legged on the pavement, he tells the officers about the bomb, about the notes, and about the threats. At 3:18 p.m., before the bomb squad can arrive, the device detonates. Brian Wells was killed instantly. The investigation reveals a story stranger than fiction. A twisted plot involving a scavenger hunt, a murder-for-hire scheme, and a group of unlikely co-conspirators. At the center, Marjorie Armstrong, diagnosed with multiple mental disorders. She masterminded the robbery to finance a hit on her own father so she could inherit his fortune. Kenneth Barnes, her accomplice, a crack dealer, enlisted to carry out the murder. He agreed in exchange for a cut of the bank money. Then there was William Rothstein, a former boyfriend of Marjorie's. His home? The same location where Wells received the collar bomb. Floyd Stockton, another man living with Rothstein at the time, helps put the bomb on Wells. He later gets immunity for testifying. Initially, Wells appeared to be a victim, but the deeper the investigators dug, the murkier things got. Evidence showed he may have known about the plot. He believed the bomb was fake, but it wasn't. In 2007, Armstrong and Barnes were charged. Barnes pled guilty and cooperated. Armstrong was sentenced to life in prison. She died in custody in 2017. The case became the subject of the 2018 Netflix docuseries, Evil Genius, uncovering the chilling layers behind what may be the most bizarre bank heist in American history. a man manipulated, a collar bomb, a deadly scavenger hunt, and a plan so bizarre, even Hollywood couldn't make it up. Rhode Island. Cam Lyman was known in the elite world of dog breeding, wealthy, private, and respected for breeding champion Clumber Spaniels. Cam was eccentric, intensively private, and by the early 1990s, largely reclusive. Lyman lived in a sprawling estate in Hopkinton, Rhode Island, but what was once a place of prestige would become the center of a chilling mystery. In 1993, friends began to grow concerned. Cam had seemingly vanished. The caretaker, George O'Neill, claimed Lyman had simply gone west to California. But no one had seen or heard from Cam in months. Even the dogs had been left behind. When police were finally brought in, inconsistencies piled up. Mail was uncollected. Lyman's bank accounts sat untouched. And O'Neill? He had begun wearing Lyman's clothes, driving Lyman's car, and managing finances as if nothing was wrong. Yet despite the red flags, the investigation stalled. For years, Cam Lyman remained a missing person. Then in 1997, 4 years later, everything changed. During renovations on Lyman's property, a septic tank was opened. Inside were the skeletal remains of Cam Lyman, wrapped in plastic, hidden from the world for years. The medical examiner ruled it a homicide. Suspicion immediately turned to George O'Neill, but despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, he was never charged with murder. He claimed he had nothing to do with the death, and without definitive proof, the case went cold. Cam Lyman's murder remains unsolved to this day. No justice, no answers, just the lingering mystery of a wealthy recluse whose death was buried, literally, and whose story still haunts Rhode Island's quiet corners. South Carolina. The Murdaugh name has been long synonymous with power and privilege in South Carolina's Low Country. For nearly a century, the Murdaugh family controlled the local legal system, with 3 generations of lawyers holding the position of solicitor, the top prosecutor for the area. But beneath this legacy of influence, dark secrets festered. In June of 2021, a shocking event would unravel the Murdaugh dynasty, a tragic murder that would captivate the nation. The story begins at the family estate, Moselle, a sprawling property where Alex Murdaugh, a prominent lawyer, lived with his wife, Maggie, and their 2 sons, Paul and Buster. On the evening of June 7, 2021, Alex Murdaugh, a 53-year-old attorney, arrived at the family's hunting lodge. Inside, he found the bodies of his wife Maggie and their youngest son Paul. Both had been shot multiple times. Maggie Murdaugh had been shot with an assault rifle, and Paul had been shot with a shotgun. Their bodies were discovered near the dog kennels on the property. Alex, devastated and hysterical, called 911, claiming that he had just discovered their bodies. He told dispatch that he had gone to visit his sick father and mother, but when he returned, he found his family dead. A 911 call was one of the first pieces of evidence that law enforcement would scrutinize. The details seemed suspicious. Why hadn't Alex noticed anything out of place when he first arrived at the house? Why was he so calm on the phone? Soon after the bodies were discovered, the investigation into the murders began. But what was initially a tragic double homicide quickly turned into a complex web of lies, deceit, and hidden family secrets. At first, Alex Murdaugh was considered a grieving husband and father. However, law enforcement began to question the circumstances surrounding the deaths. Witnesses came forward saying Alex's behavior was odd. Investigators discovered that he had been at the crime scene around the time of the murders, but hadn't mentioned it initially. One of the reasons why investigators began to turn their focus on Alex was because of Paul Murdaugh's ongoing legal issues. Just months earlier, Paul had been involved in a boating accident that led to the death of 19-year-old Mallory Beach. Paul had been facing charges for boating under the influence, and his family's legal team was embroiled in a battle to get him off the hook. Paul's involvement in the boating accident had caused public outrage, and many speculated that the Murdaugh family's legal influence would ensure Paul avoided serious consequences. The anger from the Beach family and the public, combined with the mystery of his sudden death, made Paul a possible target. But there was more to Alex Murdaugh than met the eye. As the investigation continued, it was revealed that Alex was facing severe financial problems. He had been embezzling millions of dollars from his law firm and clients, using the funds to fuel his lavish lifestyle and cover up his debts. His financial ruin was a ticking time bomb. In addition to his legal and financial troubles, Alex had been involved in a number of suspicious incidents. There was the mysterious death of his housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield, in 2018. She had died after allegedly tripping and falling at the Murdaugh estate, but questions were raised about whether her death had been accidental. Alex had also collected a large insurance payout after her death. Everyone in the community knew the Murdaughs, but no one really knew what was going on behind closed doors. Alex had his hand in everything, and people were beginning to see the cracks in the family's empire. As investigators dug deeper into Alex's personal and professional life, they uncovered a shocking web of lies. In September 2021, Alex admitted to hiring a hitman to kill him in a botched suicide attempt. He claimed it was part of a life insurance scheme to secure money for his surviving son, Buster. The scheme had backfired. Alex's financial troubles and the pressure from the investigation led to the stunning revelation that Alex had orchestrated the murders of his wife and son. In his confession, Alex claimed that he had shot them to end their suffering, though many still question the validity of his statement. In July 2022, Alex Murdaugh was indicted for the murders of Maggie and Paul. His arrest shocked the community, and the Murdaugh family's once pristine reputation was irreparably shattered. The trial of Alex Murdaugh began in early 2023. The prosecution laid out a damning case, presenting evidence of Alex's financial crimes, his lies about the murders, and his complicated history with his family. The defense, however, argued that Alex had been wrongfully accused and that there was no concrete evidence linking him to the crime. The trial was a spectacle, with the Murdaugh name still carrying weight in the courtroom, but the evidence was overwhelming. Alex Murdaugh was convicted of the murders of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh. On March 2, 2023, Alex Murdaugh was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders of his wife and son. The case, once a tragedy, became a story of greed, power, and corruption, a tale that would forever haunt the Murdaugh name. The legacy of the Murdaugh family has been shattered, leaving behind a trail of devastation and broken lives. What seemed like a story of privilege and power turned out to be a darker tale of betrayal and murder. South Dakota. Larissa Lone Hill, a 16-year-old girl from the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, vanished without a trace in the summer of 2017. Her disappearance, which baffled both the local community and law enforcement, has remained one of the most unsettling cases in the area. Larissa, described as a bright and caring teenager, had lived most of her life on the reservation. On the night of her disappearance, she was last seen leaving her family's home to meet a friend. Her mother, Shirley Lone Hill, later told reporters that Larissa had been in good spirits earlier in the day and that there was no indication that anything unusual was about to happen. But hours later, when Larissa didn't return home, her family began to worry. Law enforcement was quickly notified. The tribal police department launched an extensive search in the area, aided by community members and volunteers. Yet despite their efforts, no one could find any clues. Her phone was found abandoned near a field, but Larissa herself was nowhere to be found. As the days stretched into weeks, the search expanded. Authorities interviewed friends, family, and anyone who might have seen or heard anything. They even reached out to nearby police departments for assistance, but still, no trace of Larissa emerged. Her disappearance sparked frustration and a sense of urgency, both in the reservation community and nationwide. Despite numerous theories being proposed, ranging from a possible runaway situation to foul play, the case grew colder and colder. Months went by without a break in the case. Community members began to feel that the investigation was being ignored by authorities. Many believed that systemic issues, such as the jurisdictional complexity between local and federal law enforcement, were making it harder to get the necessary attention for the case. But Larissa's family wasn't about to give up. They continued their own investigation, reaching out to the media, drawing attention to the lack of progress in the case. Shirley Lone Hill and other relatives began organizing events, marches, and meetings demanding justice and closure. The case became a symbol of the larger issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, a tragic and underreported epidemic across North America. Despite the lack of progress in the investigation, the case garnered attention from activists and organizations working to bring more focus to the violence and disappearances of Indigenous women and girls. The hashtag Find Larissa was used on social media to rally support for the search. In 2018, a candlelight vigil was held in Larissa's honor. Local leaders and activists spoke about the challenges Indigenous communities face in having their cases taken seriously by law enforcement, which they say often results in long delays and insufficient resources for investigations. As time went on, multiple theories emerged. Some speculated that Larissa had been the victim of human trafficking, while others believed she had run away. But no definitive evidence has ever confirmed either of these theories. Over the years, the case has brought attention to the disproportionate number of missing Indigenous women and girls across the United States. Larissa's disappearance is part of a much larger and troubling pattern that has only recently begun to receive the focus it deserves. Though Larissa Lone Hill's disappearance remains unsolved, it continues to serve as a reminder for the vulnerability of Indigenous women and the need for greater action and resources to address these cases. Her family and those who continue to search for her had not given up hope that one day they'll find answers. The search for Larissa Lone Hill is far from over. As more people learn about her case, the hope remains that someone, somewhere, will come forward with information that could bring this young girl home. Until then, her family's fight for justice continues. Tennessee. In January 2007, two college students from the University of Tennessee, Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom, were violently abducted, tortured, and murdered in one of the most horrific crimes in Knoxville's history. What would happen to them and the brutality they endured would leave an indelible mark on their families, their community, and the nation. Shannon Christian, a 21-year-old senior, and Christopher Newsom, a 23-year-old factory worker, were a young couple in love. On the evening of January 6th, they had plans to go out on a casual date, dinner and a trip to a friend's house. They never made it. At around 9 p.m., Christopher was waiting by Shannon's car as she ran inside to grab something. As she stepped back into the car, both were ambushed. Christopher and Shannon were carjacked by a group of 4 individuals. They were taken to an abandoned house, isolated from the outside world, where their fate would take a horrific turn. The house, located in a seedy part of Knoxville, became their prison. Here, the unimaginable began. Christopher Newsom was tied up, forced to endure unspeakable violence, and was eventually shot execution style, his body dumped on some railroad tracks. Meanwhile, Shannon Christian was subjected to hours of torture and abuse. The perpetrators subjected her to heinous acts that are too disturbing to describe. After several hours of this brutality, Shannon was also murdered. Her body was left in a trash can and was found days later. The case remained unsolved for several days, with authorities initially struggling to piece together the events. It wasn't until a break came when police discovered Christopher's body near the railroad tracks, and then later, Shannon's remains in the trash can. Through their investigation, police identified the 4 suspects. Lamarcus Davidson was the ringleader, a convicted felon who had recently been released from prison. His half-brother, Latalvis Cobbins, along with their accomplices, George Thomas and Vanessa Coleman, were all arrested. The details that emerged in court were chilling. Davidson, Cobbins, Thomas, and Coleman were charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and assault. Their trial captivated the nation, revealing the extent of the violence these 2 young victims endured. The courtroom was filled with emotion as Shannon and Christopher's families faced their tormentors. The trials were long and drawn out, with each defendant trying to shift blame onto others. But in the end, justice would be served, though no amount of punishment could bring back Shannon and Christopher. Lamarcus Davidson was sentenced to death. Latalvis Cobbins received a life sentence. George Thomas was also sentenced to life, and Vanessa Coleman, the only female defendant, was given a 53-year sentence after being found guilty of lesser charges. The tragedy left a lasting impact, on the families of Channing Christian and Christopher Newsom. Their loved ones continue to remember them as more than just victims. They were two young people with bright futures, whose lives were cut short by senseless violence. For the families of Channing and Christopher, the fight for justice didn't end in the courtroom. It became a lifelong mission to ensure that their memories are honored and that such a horrific crime is never forgotten. The murders of Channing and Christopher are a grim reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors. Though justice was served, the pain of losing them will never fade. Their story serves as a haunting reminder of how fragile life can be and how important it is to hold on to love, light, and the memories of those we've lost. Texas. In 2001, Andrea Yates made headlines for committing one of the most tragic and controversial acts of the 21st century, the drowning of her 5 children. This case captivated the nation, not just because of the horrifying nature of the crime, but because of the complex questions it raised about mental illness, motherhood, and the criminal justice system. Andrea Yates was born in 1964 in Texas. She grew up in a conservative religious household and showed early signs of being a bright, capable woman. After graduating from high school, she attended the University of Texas, where she studied nursing. It was there that she met Rusty Yates, a fellow student, and the two quickly fell in love. They married in 1993, and soon after, Andrea became a mother. However, beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect family, there were significant struggles. Andrea had long struggled with mental health issues, but it wasn't until after the birth of her first child, Noah, in 1994, that things began to unravel. She was diagnosed with postpartum depression, a serious mental health condition that affects some women after childbirth. But as time went on, her depression grew deeper, and it was evident that Andrea was not getting the help she needed. Andrea gave birth to her second son, John, in 1995. By this time, her mental health was deteriorating rapidly. She suffered from severe postpartum depression, anxiety, and even psychotic episodes. After John's birth, Andrea attempted, and she was hospitalized. Rusty, however, was determined to have a large family and insisted they continue having children. Over the next few years, Andrea gave birth to 3 more children, Paul, Luke, and Mary. Each time her mental state worsened. Andrea's depression deepened into full-blown psychosis, and she became convinced that she was an unfit mother, unworthy of raising her children. Her delusions were amplified by her religious beliefs, which became more extreme. She believed that her children were going to hell, and that the only way to save them was to kill them. On June 20th, 2001, Andrea Yates took this belief to its tragic conclusion. She waited for Rusty to leave the house, and then, one by one, she methodically drowned her 5 children in a bathtub. After the murders, Andrea didn't flee or try to cover up her crime. Instead, she called Rusty at work and told him what she had done. She then called 911, stating, "I killed my children." When the police arrived, Andrea was sitting calmly in the living room, her demeanor detached and emotionless, almost as if she were in a daze. The police quickly arrested Andrea, and she was charged with 5 counts of murder. The media frenzy surrounding the case was immediate. Many people were shocked by the crime, but even more were divided over what should happen to Andrea. Was she a cold-blooded killer, or was she a woman so mentally ill that she couldn't be held responsible for her actions. Andrea's trial began in 2002. The defense argued that she was severely mentally ill at the time of the killings. They presented evidence that Andrea had been suffering from postpartum psychosis, a rare and severe mental illness that can cause women to lose touch with reality. Her mental state at the time of the killings was central to the case. Experts testified that Andrea believed she was saving her children from eternal damnation by killing them. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They argued that Andrea was sane at the time of the murders, that she knew what she was doing and had planned the killings. They suggested that she may have been motivated by a desire to escape her responsibilities as a mother, rather than by a genuine belief that her children were in danger. The jury ultimately found Andrea Yates guilty of capital murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. However, the case didn't end there. In 2006, after new evidence emerged and questions were raised about the testimony used in her conviction, Andrea's case was re-examined. Key witnesses had testified about her mental state, and the prosecution's case was criticized for using outdated and misleading information. In 2006, a Texas appeals court overturned Andrea's conviction. The court ruled that her conviction had been based on false testimony and that her mental illness had not been adequately taken into account. As a result, Andrea Yates was granted a new trial. In 2006, she was retried and found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to a psychiatric hospital where she has remained ever since. Today, Andrea Yates remains in a psychiatric facility, and while she may never be fully well, she has received the mental health care she desperately needed. Rusty Yates, despite the unimaginable tragedy that befell his family, has publicly forgiven Andrea. He has been vocal about the role mental illness played in his wife's actions and has advocated for better mental health care for new mothers. The Andrea Yates case remains one of the most tragic and complex criminal cases in American history. It raises uncomfortable questions about the intersection of mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the justice system. And it serves as a stark reminder of the devastating impact untreated mental illness can have on families. Utah. Lori Vallow, a mother of two, and her new husband, Chad Daybell, became the focus of an investigation that would unravel a dark and twisted tale. In 2019, Lori's two children, 7-year-old JJ Vallow and 17-year-old Tylee Ryan, were reported missing by concerned family members. JJ's grandparents, Kay and Larry Woodcock, raised alarm when they hadn't heard from him for months. Tylee's family also grew suspicious, but Lori and Chad weren't exactly cooperating. The couple had moved to Idaho, leaving behind their families, and soon it became clear that something wasn't right. Lori was seen publicly with Chad, but there was no sign of the children. In fact, Lori didn't seem to care much about their absence. Police later discovered that Lori had lied about the children's whereabouts multiple times, and that's when things really began to unravel. Lori and Chad had become entangled in a belief system that was unorthodox, to say the least. Chad, a self-published author, wrote books about the afterlife and end times prophecies. Lori, who was married several times before, met Chad in 2018. It wasn't long before they began sharing a strange, shared belief in the concept of zombies, people who had lost their spiritual essence and became dangerous. In their eyes, certain people around them had turned into these zombies, including Lori's children. They believed that Tylee and JJ were somehow possessed and needed to be removed. At the same time, Lori was becoming more distant from her family, including her brother Alex Cox, who played an increasingly sinister role in the unfolding story. Before the children's disappearance, Lori's ex-husband, Charles Vallow, was shot and killed by Alex Cox in what he claimed was an act of self-defense. However, many believed it was part of Lori's plan to remove obstacles standing in her way. Charles had been concerned about Lori's mental state, especially her growing obsession with Chad and her beliefs. Meanwhile, Chad's previous wife, Tammy Daybell, was also found dead in October 2019 under suspicious circumstances. Initially, her death was ruled natural, but after the discovery of the children's disappearance, authorities began to investigate her death further. In 2020, after the children were found, Tammy's death was reclassified as a homicide. In November 2019, after Lori and Chad refused to cooperate with investigators, authorities issued a warrant for the couple's arrest. On June 9, 2020, JJ's remains were found in a wooded area on Chad Daybell's property. A day later, Tylee's remains were also discovered nearby. The discovery of the children's bodies was horrifying. They had been buried in shallow graves, and it was clear that they had been dead for months before they were found. Lori and Chad had kept up their charade, even holding a memorial for the children, while their remains were lying just yards away. The investigation into the deaths of JJ and Tylee led to the arrests of Lori and Chad. Lori was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and grand theft, among other charges. Chad faced similar charges, including the murder of his first wife, Tammy. In early 2021, Alex Cox, who had been involved in the deaths of Charles and Tammy, mysteriously died from what authorities called natural causes. However, his sudden death only added to the eerie, suspicious nature of the entire case. Lori and Chad's trial began in 2023, and the shocking details of the case emerged. The prosecution painted a picture of a couple who were willing to go to any lengths, including murder, to satisfy their twisted religious beliefs. The defense tried to argue that Lori's mental state was compromised, but the evidence against them was overwhelming. The case continues to leave people in shock, not just because of the tragic deaths, but because of the bizarre religious beliefs that played a role in the murders. Families across the nation were left grappling with the senseless deaths of 2 innocent children whose lives were tragically cut short by the actions of their own mother and her new husband. In 2023, Lori was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and Chad Daybell was sentenced to death. Lori and Chad's case will likely be remembered as one of the most disturbing stories in recent criminal history. Vermont. In March 2012, Melissa Jenkins, a 33-year-old mother and schoolteacher from St. Johnsbury, Vermont, went missing under mysterious circumstances. Her body was discovered a week later, and what followed was a shocking and twisted tale of betrayal and murder. Melissa's disappearance sent ripples through her community. She was a beloved teacher, an active member of the community, and a devoted mother to her young son. Her sudden absence seemed inexplicable. Her friends and family immediately feared something was terribly wrong. It wasn't until March 19, 2012, that her body was discovered in the Connecticut River, roughly 5 miles from her home. The discovery was made after an extensive search, but what the authorities found would raise more questions than answers. The investigation began quickly, but it wasn't clear how Melissa had ended up in the river. The authorities soon realized that there was something more sinister at play. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to her head, and there was evidence of a violent struggle. Melissa had been last seen leaving her home on March 18th, telling a friend she was meeting someone to talk. But who was this person, and why hadn't she returned home? These were the questions authorities needed to answer, and quickly. As investigators dug deeper, a disturbing connection came to light. Melissa had an ex-boyfriend named Brian Charette. They had broken up months earlier, but they had maintained some level of contact, largely due to their shared custody of Melissa's young son. Brian Charette quickly became a person of interest. Melissa had been in contact with him shortly before her disappearance. They had argued in the past, and it seemed that there was unresolved tension between them. But investigators needed more. The breakthrough came when authorities focused on Brian's vehicle. They found blood inside his car that matched Melissa's DNA. This revelation shifted the investigation in a new direction. Brian was arrested and charged with her murder. It was soon revealed that Brian had become increasingly jealous and obsessive after the breakup. Melissa had begun dating someone new, and Brian couldn't cope with it. He wanted to rekindle their relationship, but she had moved on. On the day of her disappearance, Melissa had arranged to meet Brian under the guise of discussing their son's custody arrangements. But what was meant to be a peaceful meeting turned violent. Brian, in a fit of rage, attacked her. He struck her repeatedly, and she died from blunt force trauma to her head. During his trial, the prosecution presented a chilling case. They argued that Brian had planned the murder and that they had evidence to support this claim. Not only had he attacked Melissa, but he had disposed of her body in the river, hoping to cover up his crime. In the end, the jury found Brian Charette guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison for the brutal killing of Melissa Jenkins. Her son, left without his mother, would have to grow up without the woman who had been his whole world. The murder of Melissa Jenkins shook the small town of St. Johnsbury, leaving a lasting scar. Her death reminded the community that even in peaceful places, tragedy can strike unexpectedly. Melissa's family and friends continue to honor her memory, and her son grows up surrounded by love and support, though he will never fully escape the pain of losing his mother. Melissa Jenkins may be gone, but she is not forgotten. Her story is a tragic reminder of how quickly a life can be taken, and how even the closest relationships can be deceiving. Virginia. On September 13, 2014, 18-year-old Hannah Graham, a student at the University of Virginia, went out with friends in Charlottesville, Virginia. The night was supposed to be just another fun night out, but it would end in tragedy. Around 1 a.m. after leaving a party, Hannah was seen walking alone through the streets. She was headed towards her apartment, but never made it. Security footage shows her walking near a bar seemingly lost. Her friends later reported that they lost contact with her, and by the time they realized something was wrong, it was too late. The next morning, when Hannah didn't return home, her parents grew worried. The authorities were alerted, and a massive search began. Local police, along with volunteers and search dogs, combed the area, hoping to find her. The search was urgent as it became clear Hannah had vanished without a trace. Meanwhile, police had begun to review surveillance footage from around the city. They discovered something chilling. Hannah had been captured on camera in the company of a man. The man seen with Hannah in this footage was identified as 32-year-old Jesse Leroy Matthew Jr. He was a hospital worker from Charlottesville, and his movements that night seemed suspicious. As investigators dug deeper, they realized that Matthew had been near Hannah earlier in the evening. The police traced his movements, and it turned out that he had been seen following Hannah as she wandered alone through the streets. By all appearances, he had been deliberately stalking her. As the investigation continued, it became apparent that Matthew wasn't just a random suspect. In 2005, a young woman named Morgan Harrington had gone missing after attending a concert at the University of Virginia. Her remains were discovered 3 years later, and DNA evidence eventually linked her case to Jesse Matthew. The connection raised even more alarms. Was he a serial offender? Did his history of violent crime extend beyond Hannah and Morgan? On October 1st, 2014, after nearly 3 weeks of searching, police made a significant breakthrough. Jesse Matthew was arrested in Galveston, Texas. He had fled the area but was tracked down after authorities identified him through DNA samples found at the scene of Morgan Harrington's murder. Matthew was charged with abduction with intent to defile. As the case progressed, investigators found that he had taken Hannah's phone and used it to make calls, further implicating him in her disappearance. On October 18, 2014, after Jesse Matthews' arrest, a body was discovered in a remote area of Albemarle County, Virginia. Authorities confirmed it was Hannah Graham. The body was found several miles from where she was last seen. The news of her death sent shockwaves through the community. What was supposed to be a typical night out for a college student had turned into a nightmare. In 2016, Jesse Matthews stood trial for the murder of Hannah Graham. The evidence against him was overwhelming. DNA evidence linked him to the crime scene, and his actions the night of her disappearance were reconstructed with chilling accuracy. Matthew pleaded guilty to her murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the trial, it was revealed that he had a long history of violence against women, but he was never fully held accountable until after Hannah's death. Hannah's murder deeply impacted the community of Charlottesville and beyond. Her family, especially her parents, were left to cope with the devastating loss of a bright young woman with so much potential. In the wake of her death, there were calls for increased security measures on college campuses and a more comprehensive approach to preventing violence against women. Hannah's story is a painful reminder of how one night can change everything, but it also sparked important conversations about safety, justice, and accountability. While Hannah's life was tragically cut short, her family and friends continue to honor her memory. Washington. In the early 1980s, a quiet and peaceful city in the Pacific Northwest, Seattle, Washington, would unknowingly become the hunting grounds for one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. For years, the Green River Killer evaded capture, leaving a trail of tragedy in his wake. It all started in 1982 when the body of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield was discovered near the Green River. The discovery set off a series of events that would shake the community to its core. Within weeks, the bodies of other young women began turning up along the river's banks. All of them had one thing in common. They were adult workers. and they were found strangled. Over the next 5 years, the Green River Killer claimed the lives of at least 49 women. The police were stumped, and the killer's cold, calculated methods, strangling his victims and leaving their bodies in remote wooded areas, made it clear that they were dealing with a methodical predator. In 1984, the case went cold. The authorities struggled to make progress. The killer was elusive, and the victims' lives were often treated with indifference by the media. But then, in 1985, a major break came. Gary Ridgway, a truck painter, was arrested in connection with the murder. But Ridgway was released when they couldn't connect him to the murders. He was, at the time, just one of many suspects, but the police would circle back to him years later. Born in 1949, Gary Ridgway grew up in a family full of tension and dysfunction. His mother was overbearing and critical, while his father was emotionally distant. These early experiences seemed to have a lasting effect on Ridgway. Ridgway, as an adult, had trouble forming meaningful relationships with women. His marriages were troubled, and his obsessions would later come to define him. His frustration with women and his twisted need to dominate them led to his horrific killing spree. The victims were often vulnerable women, working as adult workers along the highways of Seattle. Many of them struggled with addiction or homelessness, which made it easier for Ridgway to lure them into his truck. Once he had them in his vehicle, he would take them to secluded locations and strangle them. The Green River was where many of the bodies were found, but not all of them. Ridgway's reach extended far beyond the river banks. His killing field stretched across Washington state, making it all the more difficult for authorities to track him down. In the late 1980s, the investigation hit a dead end. That was until DNA technology advanced in the 1990s. For the first time, investigators could use genetic evidence to connect a suspect to a crime scene. A breakthrough came in 2001 when DNA linked Ridgway to the murder of several victims. Ridgway had been living right under the police's nose, working as a truck painter in the same city where the murders took place. He had been a suspect for years, but now, with DNA evidence tying him to the crimes, investigators had the proof they needed. On November 30th, 2001, Gary Ridgway was arrested and charged with the murders of 4 women. As the investigation continued, Ridgway's confession became a chilling account of his life of crimes. Ridgway confessed to killing 71 women over a span of 20 years. However, due to his guilty plea and cooperation, many of the cases remained unsolved. In 2003, Ridgway pled guilty to 48 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His confession revealed the depth of his depravity, and he took investigators to the locations of some of the victims' remains. He offered no remorse for his actions, only cold, calculated descriptions of his murders. Ridgway's capture and conviction brought some measure of closure to the families of the victims, but the true scale of his crimes is still chilling. The Green River Killer had been a phantom for decades, evading capture while causing unimaginable pain and loss. Gary Ridgway's story is one of darkness and horror, but it also stands as a reminder that sometimes justice comes when it's least expected, when the past catches up with the present and the truth finally comes to light. West Virginia. In the small town of Star City, West Virginia, the peaceful and tight-knit community was rocked by a crime so shocking that it would grab national headlines. Skylar Neese was 16 years old when she disappeared in the summer of 2012. She had everything ahead of her, an outgoing, friendly teenager known for her bubbly personality. She lived with her parents, Dave and Mary Neese, and had a close-knit group of friends. But behind the seemingly normal life, Skylar was keeping secrets, especially from her parents. Skylar's two best friends, Rachel Schoaf and Sheila Eddy, were the center of her world. They hung out together at school, shared the usual teenage experiences, and lived their lives in the small town with an unspoken bond. But beneath the surface, things weren't as they seemed. Skylar had started to drift away from her friends, growing more distant and often keeping to herself. She began to express her frustrations to her parents, especially about her friendships with Rachel and Sheila. Skylar's parents noticed the tension, but never imagined it would lead to something far worse. On the night of July 6th, 2012, Skylar went to bed like any other night, seemingly preparing for another day of summer fun. But as the night went on, Skylar made a decision that would change everything. She snuck out of her house around midnight. Her parents had no idea. Skylar had texted Sheila and Rachel that she was coming over to hang out. They picked her up in the middle of the night around 12:30 a.m. The plan was simple: drive around for a bit, maybe go to a party. But Skylar didn't return home that night. When Skylar didn't return, her parents were frantic. They called the police and soon a search began. But there was something odd about her disappearance. Skylar's phone, her belongings, and all traces of her seemed to vanish. At first, authorities treated it like a typical missing persons case, but as days passed, the situation grew darker. Skylar had been friends with Rachel and Sheila for years, but now both girls were acting strange, avoiding questions, being vague in their answers. As the investigation continued, police began to dig deeper into the girls' lives. The breakthrough came when Rachel Schoaf broke down under intense questioning. She revealed the horrifying truth. She and Sheila had plotted Skylar's murder. But what led them to this? In the months before Skylar's death, both Rachel and Sheila had been growing more and more resentful of her. Skylar had become distant from them, and according to Rachel, Sheila was the one who first suggested they kill Skylar. It was supposed to be a simple plan: get rid of her and not get caught. On the night of July 6th, after picking up Skylar, the three drove out into the woods, just a short distance from their town. What happened next was chilling. Skylar, unaware of the horror awaiting her, was dragged out of the car and into the woods. Rachel and Sheila then stabbed her repeatedly. They left Skylar's body there, hoping it would never be found. But the police weren't ready to give up. They scoured the area for weeks, and after Rachel's confession, authorities found Skylar's body in a remote part of the woods, not far from where she was last seen. The investigation into Rachel and Sheila's motives revealed that while Skylar's murder was premeditated, it was fueled by a mix of jealousy and resentment. Skylar had become more distant from her friends, and the bond between Sheila and Rachel was stronger than ever. But neither of them thought through the consequences of their actions. It was only after Rachel's confession that the true horror of what had happened came to light. In the months following the murder, both girls were arrested and tried for their roles in Skylar's death. Rachel pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Sheila, on the other hand, denied any involvement at first, but later changed her plea. In 2013, Sheila was sentenced to life in prison, eligible for parole after 15 years. Skylar Neese's death shocked everyone who knew her, especially her parents. Dave and Mary Neese fought for justice for their daughter, not just in the courts, but by speaking out about the dangers of online relationships and the importance of being aware of the people in your life. Skylar's story serves as a tragic reminder of the darkness that can exist even within the closest of friendships. What was once a peaceful town now had a painful scar, and the lives of those involved would never be the same again. Skylar Neese's story is one that still resonates with so many people today. It's a tragedy that unfolded behind the closed doors of a friendship, and it shows just how much we might not know about the people closest to us. The loss of Skylar is a loss that can never be replaced, but it also serves as a reminder to be vigilant, to trust, and to truly know the people in your life. Wisconsin. In 1985, Stephen Avery was a 23-year-old man living in Manitowoc County, Wisconsin. His life, already marked by a few run-ins with the law, was about to change dramatically. Avery had been convicted of a brutal crime that he insisted he didn't commit. He was sentenced to 32 years in prison, but then, in 2003, something extraordinary happened. After spending 18 years behind bars, Stephen Avery's conviction was overturned. DNA testing, which hadn't been available during his trial, proved his innocence. The real culprit, a man named Gregory Allen, was identified, and Avery was released. It was a rare moment of justice. For Avery, the world had finally righted itself. But the story wasn't over. In fact, the darkest chapter of his life was about to begin. Less than 2 years later, in 2005, tragedy struck again. Teresa Halbach, a 25-year-old photographer, went missing. She had been sent to the Avery property to take pictures of a vehicle for an Auto Trader magazine. Her car was later found on the property, and the investigation led authorities to Stephen Avery. Avery was arrested for her murder. He denied involvement, but evidence soon started to stack up against him. Police claimed that they found Halbach's blood in his garage. The prosecution also pointed to human remains found on the Avery property that were identified as Halbach's. It appeared that Avery, just months after being exonerated, had committed another heinous crime. But from the beginning, Avery's defense team argued that he was framed. They pointed out numerous inconsistencies in the investigation. For one, they questioned why the police hadn't sealed off the property or properly gathered evidence. They also suggested that the Manitowoc County officers had a motive to set Avery up. After all, Avery had sued the county for wrongful conviction, and he was about to win a hefty sum of money. There were also allegations of planted evidence. A key piece of evidence was a bullet found in Avery's garage, which the prosecution claimed had Halbach's DNA on it, but the defense pointed out that this bullet had not been properly handled and that it could have been planted. The case took a bizarre twist when a documentary filmmaker began filming the investigation. Their documentary, Making a Murderer, would bring the story of Stephen Avery to millions of viewers and raise questions about the integrity of the justice system. Making a Murderer focused not just on Avery, but also on his nephew, Brendan Dassey, who was arrested in connection with the crime. Dassey, a teenager with a limited intellectual capacity, gave a confession that many people, including legal experts, later argued was coerced by the police. Dassey's confession was riddled with inconsistencies, and many believe that he was manipulated into implicating himself and his uncle. Brendan Dassey's story became central to the case. His confession, given without the presence of an attorney or guardian, was later deemed questionable by many. His defense team argued that Dassey had been pressured and tricked into making false statements. Still, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. In 2007, Stephen Avery was convicted of the murder of Teresa Halbach. The jury believed the evidence despite the defense's arguments. Avery was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the story didn't end there. In 2016, new developments brought hope for Avery's supporters. His legal team uncovered what they believed was evidence that could potentially exonerate him, including DNA testing that could link someone else to the crime scene. The case of Stephen Avery raised larger questions about the criminal justice system. How reliable is forensic evidence? Can people be wrongfully convicted? And how many other cases are there where people like Avery have been denied justice? To this day, Stephen Avery remains in prison, fighting for a new trial, while Brendan Dassey's case continues to be a point of contention, with some pushing for his release. Whether or not Avery will ever be exonerated and whether Dassey will be freed remains uncertain. The story of Stephen Avery is a story of both justice and tragedy, one that continues to unfold in the courts and in the public eye. And just a side note, that documentary was nonsense. He's guilty, in my opinion. Wyoming. In the quiet hills of Wyoming, two killers lived side by side for decades as husband and wife. But the most shocking part, they each committed murder separately and long before they met. This is the story of Gerald and Alice Uden and the dark family secrets they buried in the wilderness. In September 1980, Gerald Uden lured his ex-wife Virginia and her two young sons, Richard and Reagan, on a supposed hunting trip. They never returned. Motivated by money and a desire to cut ties with his past, Gerald shot all three in cold blood, his former wife and her children. He loaded their bodies into his car and drove them deep into the wilderness, dumping them in an abandoned mine shaft. With no witnesses and no recovered bodies, the case went cold. Gerald moved on, starting a new life with a woman named Alice. But Alice Uden had her own secret. Years earlier in 1974, Alice shot her third husband, Ronald Holtz, in the back of the head while he slept. She stuffed his body into a 55-gallon barrel, then hid it in an abandoned mine near Laramie. She told people he'd run off and never looked back. No one questioned it. Decades later, in 2013, cold case investigators reopened Holtz's file. The barrel was found inside Ronald's remains, almost perfectly preserved. Confronted with the evidence, Alice confessed. That confession triggered renewed attention on her husband Gerald, and soon, he too confessed, admitting to killing Virginia and her sons all those years ago. In 2014, Alice Uden was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. She died behind bars in 2019. Gerald Uden received 3 life sentences. He remains in prison, unrepentant. 2 killers, bound by marriage and blood. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you will know each time we upload a new video. Be sure to check out our playlists for more chilling content to help fall asleep. While you're there, be sure to hit the like button and leave us a comment down below. Until next time, stay curious.